I spoke about the secular worldview and the religious worldview in one particular way that was to the advantage of the secular worldview, seeing reality better than our Western religions generally have. I pointed out that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, and that we are better creatures than our religions have taught us to be with ideas like original sin. I'd like to, on the other side, talk about the fact that the evolutionary perspective, which is part of the secular worldview as I think of it, shows us that there are certain realities that the current secular worldview does not recognize, and that the religious worldview captured well. I believe, so my mission is to convey a better human story, which is seeing some things in terms of what the evolutionary perspective shows. And there are some major points that have not been pursued by the secular worldview. It has believed, for example, that moral and spiritual matters are not questions of what's real. The evolutionary perspective I have used to show that both the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension are, in every meaningful sense, real, important, and life-serving. So, just as the evolutionary perspective demonstrates that if a creature, like I spoke of previously, if a creature steps onto the path of civilization, that is such a significant breakthrough out of the evolutionarily, biologically evolved system, that there are implications of it that have not been nearly adequately recognized, and which is what that book, The Parable of Tribes, shows. But at the same time, the evolutionary perspective demonstrates that there's a reality to the idea of better and worse. It is not just a matter of opinion. There may be lots of opinions that get in there, but it's not just a matter of opinion. Evolution has selected for certain experiential tendencies because they were life-serving. They are part of what we are, and they bring into existence certain realities that could only exist in the experience of creatures that experience things that way. Experience things in terms of better and worse, which is definitely built into not only us humans, but lots of other species, and built into us in that we have a capacity for a certain special kind of experience. That the fact that it's there in our nature, that it's part of the human genome, is clear evidence that it must have been adaptive, that is, life-serving, for a creature to have that. So however you want to think about it, it's not about objective versus subjective. Value and the sacred only can exist in the subjective realm. And if you look at the evolutionary perspective, our experiential realm has developed such that these are important realities that we should attend to and honor fully because they are life-serving, or at least they have been in our ancestral past. Another reality that is in the traditional religious idea, and I got to tell you, I am really curious to know the means by which it got into the religious, because my ways of seeing it, using the evolutionary perspective, I can show that there emerges inevitably a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse or more broken. And I look at that definition, that idea of such a coherent force, always making things more broken. To me, that corresponds a whole lot to an idea that's in the religious tradition that had the name evil. You can call it a destructive force in this thing, a coherent force. You can give it various names, but it really does act like evil. And I believe I've did a video last week, or maybe it was on Monday, where I demonstrate a variety of ways the reality of there being a coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken. I showed it in, well, I think I left one of the ways out. But I showed it in terms of there being such a thing as a pure actor that consistently does that, a single actor. And I think that if you ask, well, how is it that this thing, in our case, the Nazi regime or today's Republican Party, actually, so remarkably consistent in making things worse? How do you explain that without there being something behind it that is resulting in that consistency? That seems pretty persuasive to me. I kind of like better a different way of showing it, which I've done in previous videos, and which I do on my website, abetterhumanstory.org, in a piece entitled "Showing the Discernible Reality of a Force of Evil," which has got to do with showing how if you can see in the dense network of cause and effect, how a pattern of brokenness gets moved through the human world over time in a shape-shifting way. And I end up saying, you can see that force in the same way you can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. So I invite you, if you would want to know if I actually can show that there is such a thing that is reasonably to be called a force of evil, and to see it in a purely secular kind of way where there's evidence and reason applied, and you get the conclusions that you're supposed to get from in the way that you're supposed to get it in the secular rational. That's what I've been doing. That's what I think I can show, because one of the things I could have, it's real clear to me, is the force of the good in America in our times has been greatly crippled by the fact that the secular worldview has no conceptual space for something that actually acts like a force of evil. It makes it hard to see it if you don't have a conceptual space for it. And in baseball, they say you can't hit what you can't see. And well, I've been working with the idea of forces since that idea came to me in 1970. So in 2004, when I saw something like this destructive force rising, and actually had seen some of it back in the early 90s when I listened to what was coming into the society through the 3 hours of Rush Limbaugh, 20 million ditto heads were listening to every day. I was primed to think in terms of forces, and I spent a lot of time trying to get people with a secular worldview to see that something was rising that should be understood as evil. There's a reality there that can be inferred from the consistency with which it spreads a pattern of brokenness, the consistency with which, in shape-shifting ways, and the consistency in which this pure case of a political actor is driving things in the direction that makes things really ugly. Whether it's the force that drove us to civil war in the 1850s, or the force that took over Germany in the 1930s, or over time, and took power in 1933, or whether it's this force that's taken over conservative America, which used to be a mixture of things, like most human forces are. Democratic Party, the Republican Party, us as individuals, mostly has been mixtures. But then you come up with these pure cases and you say, well, what is it that's working here that makes for such remarkable consistency? I mean, in Donald Trump in particular, I think that it is really difficult to find any place in which he does something that makes the world better than it would be if he was just not on the scene just saying or doing anything. And the same with the Republican Party that's emerged over the past 30 couple years. It's a pure case. So I say, and I can understand that I haven't proven it to everybody's satisfaction, but if you would want to know whether there's an intellectually responsible way of showing there's such a thing as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, and if you accept that, that's pretty much what we have traditionally meant in the religious world when we talked about a force of evil, that is another one of those things that the religious world seems to have grasped, that there is something going on. And I don't really understand how they grasped that. That I don't know what it looked like. I don't know what they inferred it from or what registered. I'd be interested to know how they got it. I don't imagine that the religious framework would show the thing that I claim to show in that discernible force piece that I referred to that's on my website, abetterhumanstory.org. But it's there, and the people who are aware of that evil, if they don't get caught up in lies, have often been very well equipped to defeat it. The people who really do believe in the reality of value are able to tap into a kind of passion that makes them much more effective in the world than, for example, the political force in liberal America with its secular worldview in which it thinks a lot of these things are merely subjective and just a matter of opinion. I've encountered from students at the college level and then a selective high school. I've had a couple stints of speech teaching, and I've encountered a couple in both those instances that there was a strain of thought among the students that when asked about, well, was what the Nazis did at Auschwitz wrong? I wonder how many people who are, I don't know how many people are hearing me right now, but, I would ask you, is that a question that's easy for you to answer? I got an answer to it. Yeah, it was wrong. It was wrong because good and evil, the whole issue of value has got to do with the ultimate measure of, is the human world one in which the creatures for whom there is a better or worse are having lives that are feeling better and not worse? Human beings thriving, other sentient creatures thriving. That is the definition of good. And in fact, there isn't any other definition of good other than registering in the experience of creatures to whom things matter that there could possibly be in any meaningful way. If there's nothing to which things matter, then nothing matters. A planet can blow up. A whole galaxy can blow up. What does it matter if there's nothing to whom it matters? But the secular worldview has had this sense that the only things that are real are objective. Oh, value can't exist outside of some kind of experiential realm, and the experiential realm evolves in a way that is not merely subjective, and it isn't just a matter of opinion. But I've had students say, what the Nazis did at Auschwitz isn't what I would do, but they thought it was right, and so it was right for them. I've encountered that over decades, again and again, that kind of giving second-class status to any. I mean, these are nice people. It is not what they would do, and they wouldn't like that it was doing. But the kind of judgment that would be called for to be impassioned about the wrongness of it is blocked by a secular worldview, which has consigned the moral thing to, a second-rate status, not really real, not something to be honored and attended to. I'm not saying it's easy to come to judgments of value in our, the choices that we have to make. But value is real. It's built into us, and it's built into a lot of things that are alive. The religious tradition didn't have any problem with that. They recognized, thou shalt nots and stuff like that. There wasn't any basis for, well, why shouldn't you? Well, if you feel like murdering and coveting thy neighbor's wife and stuff like that, if that seems right to you, well, then it's right for you. No, that's not how they thought about it. And I think they were right. I'm not saying, that all the different commandments were capturing, things don't get easily understood for the creature that's left the natural order and inventing its own way of life. There are a lot of difficult questions, but they are real questions, and sometimes there are obvious answers. The fascist regime is obviously worse than the bottom-up regime that our democratic constitutional society has enshrined as, well, this is how power is going to be governed. Because that book has a subtitle, The Problem of Power in Social Evolution. And that is where the problem arises, having to do with power. And the fascist way of dealing with power leads to a lot of ugliness and suffering. It's not coincidence that the same fascist spirit that led the fascist dictator in Russia to invade his unprovoked invasion of his democratic neighbor in 2022. And then it's the same thing that happened when the fascist dictator of Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. It makes the human world worse. Fascism is deeply aligned with the destructive pairings, more hate and less love, more injustice, less justice, more war, less peace. Up and down the line, there's that coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness, which means basically that there's an alignment of a whole variety of different levels of things and ways of talking about things. And one of those alignments is that between democracy and fascism, between the tyranny of the few imposing their will on the many versus the many expressing the will of the people and determining who's going to wield the power in their name and for their purposes, there is an alignment between that and good and evil. Good and evil. A coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken, that emerges inevitably, that we can, and for reasons that we can see in that evolutionary perspective, as an unleashing a systemic force that unleashes you know, destruction in a whole variety of ways, through trauma, through war, through suffering, through the imposition of enslavement, through the internalization of moralities that are hostile to our nature, all kinds of brokenness that gets spread as a result of the anarchy that the breakthrough into civilization inevitably plunges us into. And then there's the good. Not in some real easily handled way. I would say that the Ten Commandments, overall, the world is definitely a better place if those commandments are obeyed. I'm not real big on the ones that got to do with the Sabbath and graven images and stuff like that. But the other seven, you know, better to have a world in which people are not stealing and not killing, in which they're not coveting their neighbors' lives. You know, the whole schmear is a good recipe. It's not the, you know, I like the addition of love thy neighbor as thyself. That's a tough one to obey. But thou shalt nots are definitely pretty good. And we can differentiate as best we can from the ground up, tuning in on what's built into us, experiencing our own better and worse, extending that out into the world through things like do unto others and love thy neighbor. And there is a should that's in there because the evolutionary perspective or the process has continually been choosing better and worse motivational structures that have been correlated with life, the success in getting one's DNA into the future versus failure, which is what's implied by what's been selected for within us. So it is life-serving. And life-serving and creatures experiencing things positively are the best basic ways in which you can talk about the good. So the evolutionary perspective actually gives us some things that the secular worldview sort of skipped because it didn't think it was there, because I think in part because it was looking for objective reality. I mean, where is good in the cosmos? Well, it isn't there. It couldn't be there. But it is in what evolves in a living system. It's one of the creation of value is one of the strategies that evolution adopts. And likewise with the spiritual dimension. We can see that it's spread throughout the human genome that there are people who have special kinds of experiences, special in that they seem to be deep and more real, and special in that the people come back with some truths that they hold with great passion and commitment, and special in that they are impactful, that sometimes the course of lives get changed by these experiences of something that people might be inclined to call sacred. And I define sacred as value to the nth degree. That's part of what's been evolved. We can infer from the fact that it evolved that the ancestors who had that capacity or had that capacity in their group someplace were more likely to get their DNA into the future than the ones that didn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't still have this as part of a widespread, you know. I don't know if every hunting gathering band had its shaman. I'm kind of guessing that it did. I think that I've read that about a third of Americans have had some kind of experience which qualifies for entering into this special dimension that we could call spiritual. And I know that I have had several such experiences and have played a huge role in showing me what's true and important, and a huge role in giving me the calling that I've pursued since that day in 1970, when I saw a foundation stone of what I'm now calling my better human story that's got some things added onto it, but in an evolutionary perspective. I don't think the secular worldview, for the most part, well, I don't know how many people would say that the spiritual dimension of things is real, important, and life serving. I don't know how many people with a secular worldview would say that. But I'm claiming that I can show in a way that should be incorporated into the secular worldview, because it uses the evolutionary perspective to show something in a way that's consistent with the epistemology of secular evidence and logic. I think that this is one of the things that the religions have long honored and said, and it's even put at the center of our lives. People in monasteries and people going out into the wilderness to fast, and people utilizing mind-altering substances to enter into a domain that is talked about in a way which we can call it spiritual. I don't know if there are better words. The evolutionary perspective tells us to honor that. The fact that it's there is evidence that it's been life-serving. And we need all the help we can get. We're the species that might destroy ourselves. So any way we can tap into what's life-serving. So that's why I think it's important for the secular worldview to bring in the moral dimension, which can be built upon what evolution has established as real, true, important, and life-serving. And on the spiritual dimension, which is something that evolution has told us is life-serving because it has put it into us. So the religions, in their own ways, made their mistakes, like they look around the world that we live in and say, "Oi, what ugly creatures we are. We need somebody to die for our sins." But also, they captured some essential things that my work with these issues of what forces are at work in the human world has led me to believe are really important and valid, including this sentence, which I've probably written a dozen times in different things. Please go to my website. At the center of the human drama, from the beginnings of civilization, there arose, and there inevitably would arise, a battle between two coherent forces. One that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness, one that consistently works to make the human world more whole. And they are battling over which is going to shape the human world. And if you look at the dynamics of that battle, which can be shown as an empirical reality that can be perceived in the way things interact in the world, and perceived in the dense web of cause and effects, looking at what kind of causes produce what kind of effects, and for each of those effects, what kind of consequences are there to them. That there is at the center of the human drama a battle that's reasonable to call the battle between good and evil. Most of the time in American politics, our political battle has not had to do with You shouldn't see it as a battle between good and evil. When Dwight Eisenhower ran against Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956, that was not a battle between good and evil. Two fine men. But for a variety of reasons, there's been a polarization that's taken place in America. And one of our political parties has become great at fighting for power. They're insatiable. They are driven, unceasing over the many years of driving for power, not particularly interested in using that power to help anybody else, but consumed with their own lust for power and their greed. Essentially morally bankrupt, but effective in the struggle for power. On the other side, the polarization process has led to the other side of the political battle being really remarkably reliably aligned with the good, standing for all the good stuff because all the good stuff is being threatened by the other side. So everything you got to fight with the other side about, you're in the position of defending the good. It sort of happens automatically. And I think the Democrats right now are a more morally pure party than they have ever been in my lifetime, maybe ever, because the Republican Party has become this pure case of destructiveness. But the Democratic Party has been lacking in the same intensity for the battle. That's why a couple of my heroes are FDR and Churchill. Now, FDR took power essentially the same time Hitler did, 1933. And he may have been a little bit conned by, or maybe more than a little, I'm not sure, by Stalin. But he wasn't conned by Hitler. That was the problem with Churchill's predecessor, Baldwin and then Chamberlain. They were blind to what they were up against. That's the title of that book, What We're Up Against. There was a problem in Great Britain, and they almost waited too long. You know, by the time Churchill, who was warning throughout the 30s about what was rising in Germany, and it was a voice in the wilderness, the time he became prime minister at the age of 65 and feeling pretty old at that point, though he did live till he was 90. It was almost too late to save the UK. I like to call it Great Britain, but I guess that's not quite right. It leaves out something, Northern Ireland or something. I don't know. It was almost too late. By that point, what is it, June of 1940, France falls. Churchill is finally, the guy who had been warning the country is now prime minister. And the full might of the Third Reich is sort of massed at the French coast, ready to spring on Great Britain. And almost any other prime minister probably would have come to terms. But there was this willingness to stand and fight. There was a willingness to fight. And FDR did everything he could under difficult circumstances in a reluctant country, because he was willing to fight too. I kind of love to read about these men and about the way that the ugly force of fascism was defeated by them. And I'm not forgetting Stalin and what the Soviet Union did to win that war too. After Stalin signed this non-aggression pact, he's no good guy, but he was important. But it is time for the people with a secular worldview to be as impassioned as these old defenders of democracy were in the face of the fascist threat of that era. Our battle is not being fought at this point, except in Ukraine, with battleships and aircraft carriers and tanks and all that stuff that FDR supplied as an arsenal of democracy before we got into the war, and then when we got into the war. We're engaged in the same battle, but it's not being fought in the same way for the most part. But we need the same passions, the same kind of recognition that the battle between good and evil is essentially what's going on here. Top-down tyrannical power, bottom-up democratic power, easily mapped onto good and evil. Well-being of human beings, suffering of human beings, easily mapped. Real, important, and life-serving. There's a way to incorporate into the secular worldview important realities that have been missing, but were present in the religious traditions from which this secular worldview has sought to escape. Good to escape it, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not one for believing things just because authority tells me. I want to let reality speak, and the evidence of reality be processed by the human mind that has made us civilization-creating species, and to draw our conclusions on that basis. But the part of the problem I see is that the good guys in this polarized situation have been operating with a defective worldview, lacking some of the important things that the religious people understood and conveyed in the ways that they conveyed it. So I consider part of my mission, or one way of putting my mission, well, I'd say part of it, it's to flesh out the secular worldview so that the liberal America, Democratic Party, etc., will fight with the passionate intensity that the occasion calls for, because good and evil are in fact real. And the battle between them is at the center of the human drama. And how it turns out will depend how it turns out will depend whether American democracy survives and whether human civilization and maybe even our species itself survives. So we need all the passions we can get to bring to that battle. Press the battle with passionate intensity. Thank you.